Hello, movie lovers, as Dr. Hallinan likes to say. My name is Rebecca Yates, and I'm one of your fellow students in this Capstone course, Psychology in the Movies. In this point of the semester, the specific genre student presentations are beginning, as you know, and I'm starting off for my genre group, Coming of Age. Even if you think you aren't familiar with coming of age or what that means, chances are you have probably seen a few films, whether you knew it or not. Generally speaking, the genre is very popular and highly relatable to younger audiences, and basically follows stories of maturation. In these types of films, we are typically following a character or a small group of characters as they endure hardships, learn responsibility, test relationships, or find self-confidence. It's all about that slow, personal transition from innocent or naive childhood and into adulthood. My presentation specifically analyzes that transition because it seems that today's youth seem to be maturing faster and are being exposed to adult concepts and mature topics much sooner than children and adolescents did even just a couple generations ago. So in this presentation, I will be discussing why I think this phenomenon is happening, how film and other forms of media facilitate it, the possible consequences of accelerated maturity, and what we can do about it. So to start, I want to define what I mean by adult content. I decided to define adult content along the rating guidelines from the Motion Picture Association because they have a familiar source in determining what is non-offensible, suitable content for younger people and what mature audiences can watch. Now, every film is rated individually, so there isn't a singular checklist to determine a film's rating, but some of the most common elements found in adult films are violence, nudity and sex, drug usage, alcohol consumption, profanity, and other adult themes that are deemed inappropriate for children and adolescent viewers. So as I talk more about this exposure to adult content, know that I'm referring to these types of themes. So when we're talking about coming of age, what kind of content do we expect to see from this genre? If we're talking about stories of development, then we expect to see many of the common biological, psychological, and social aspects of adolescent development. If any of us remember middle school, I think we'd agree it's almost too many. This crucial time period is where we see a lot of identity development. As we get older, we start to get a good understanding of ourselves, especially in relation to the outside world. And as we're discovering ourselves, we're also discovering people like us, people we enjoy to be around with similar interests. Friendships and relationships become much more meaningful because, in part, they are also now being tested in ways that they weren't previously before. In adolescence, we are transitioning from a childhood perspective to an adult perspective, which takes physical cognitive development as well as experience. You start to gain some responsibility for yourself, plan for your future, whether it be your career or other aspirations. You no longer pursue the world aimlessly. Much of your behavior becomes more goal-oriented. So I wanted us to look at some of the most prominent and influential coming of age and maturation films over the years so that we can get a good enough sense as to how content has changed in these films. The concept of a person's teenage years did not really have a foothold until about the 1940s and 50s, and shortly following that we see one of the very first films highlighting this developmental time period in the 1955 movie Rebel Without a Cause starring James Dean. This movie depicted some of the more classic themes in coming-of-age films, such as feeling misunderstood, rebelling against your elders, asserting yourself, and quite honestly getting into trouble. Despite the fact that it was a 1955 movie and that it was aimed towards younger audiences, it actually contained a fair amount of moderate violence, casual smoking, which was more of a norm back then, and themes of love and attraction were present, but they were not arguably graphic or suggestive. In 1978, we have Grease, a classic musical that describes the trials of peer pressure in high school and discovering identity. John Hughes put out a lot of coming-of-age movies in the 80s, one of the most famous being The Breakfast Club, which heavily emphasizes self-acceptance, dealing with outside expectations, either from authority figures, family members, or other peers, and it also discusses a lot about developing friendships. My Girl in 1991, a favorite film of mine, that follows a young girl as she deals with some of the more serious realities of life, such as death, from both her mother and, towards the end of the movie, her childhood friend. I hope I'm not spoiling anything for anyone, but you've had about 30 years to watch it. It's a heartbreaking film, but it really does touch on some of the more important discussions of childhood coping and emerging into more of an adult reality. Then after about the year 2000, there seems to be a pretty stark shift in the kinds of themes in coming-of-age movies. In 2004, Mean Girls was released and is one of the most popular coming-of-age films for the current generation. There's no nudity, but sexual references are found throughout the entirety of the movie, and not just romantic sex, but also casual sex themes, even though we're talking about teenagers. There's also lots of bullying, alcohol consumption, and plenty of profanity. In 2010, Easy A is released. It also contains a lot of sexual references, which was the central theme of the film. It was a more modern take at Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. So it wouldn't have been Easy A if it didn't discuss sex and sexual innocence and those kind of topics. The point is that in the past, sex and sexuality were not previously heavily central and very apparent themes in maturation movies involving underage people. Perks of Being a Wallflower in 2012 has many themes, including friendship and body image and love, but it also introduces topics of drugs, suicide, and more graphic sexual interactions between teenagers. There's also quite a bit of violence, profanity, and emotionally upsetting topics. Now, it's rated R, which I find very interesting because why would movies about adolescents, intended for adolescents, not even meet the criteria for that age group to view? Kind of an interesting thought. Although these are just a small handful of films out of a very large genre, we can definitely see a shift in content in coming-of-age movies that contain much more adult content. As described in the last slide, there are many elements of maturation that go beyond sex, alcohol, drug consumption, and profanity, yet these are the prime representations of adulthood in modern coming-of-age films. When we think about the influence of media, we now have to also consider other media mediums. Whereas media used to refer solely to film, new technology has expanded substantially within the last several decades, and televisions are now more prominent in households, and mobile devices are smarter and more mainstream. We have moved into an age where we no longer have to wait until something airs to view it. We can record, we can watch later, binge watch, turn on the TV or mobile device to indulge at any given moment. For our young people, that means that we have an incredible array of digital influence on an impressionable audience. It is important to note that children and young adults are not giving up old versions of media as new ones come along. As described by Roberts et al. In 2005, new media is simply adding to the total amount of media consumed. As popular as it is in the film industry, it might not be a surprise that there is no shortage of television shows in the coming-of-age genre as well. There seem to be countless shows revolving around teenagers and the high school setting. In some of the more popular shows of today, adult content can be considerably graphic. Although there are plenty of examples, I chose to discuss two of the more popular TV shows that young teens have been watching, the first being Euphoria, an HBO show that revolves around teenagers in high school facing extreme violence, drugs, and sex. As I mentioned earlier, this is another example of how programs about teens, made for teens, do not even meet the rating criteria for those age groups, as Euphoria is rated TVMA. Another controversial but popular television show is 13 Reasons Why, a story that explores the reasons as to why a young high school teenage girl decided to commit suicide, largely due to bullying. Don't get me wrong, especially in today's time, in an age of cyberbullying, these types of conversations can be very important, but I'm not entirely sure about how it's portrayed in this Netflix series. Viewers actually watch the suicide scene in which Hannah kills herself. There's also several graphic rape scenes and other adult content such as violence and self-harm. It's pretty startling that such sensitive topics that should be met with caution and should be discussed thoughtfully were so vividly and disturbingly displayed. Netflix actually had to go back and edit out some of these scenes because it was simply too graphic for the audience it was intended for. I actually saw some of these scenes myself before they were edited out, and even though I am much older than the ratings call for, I found it to be extremely disturbing and triggering. I can't even imagine how upsetting it must have been for younger audiences. So adult content is found in TV shows meant for younger people, but adolescents are also being exposed to adult content simply because they review things that they shouldn't. However, there are shows that are clearly intended for adults, such as those that come on Adult Swim, but are being aired on the exact same channels as cartoons. So a child could be staying up watching their favorite age-appropriate shows and then be all of a sudden watching a show with graphic violence, sex references, profanity, and other adult themes, which is highly likely given the epidemic of televisions in bedrooms, something I'll get into more in just a little bit. So, as we have seen in coming-of-age films and TV shows, our views on maturation seem to have changed greatly. According to David Elkind, the old perspectives of maturation seem to exemplify young people as naive or innocent, kind of clueless about the realities and dangers of life, who really rely on adults and other authority figures to help guide their growth. Similar to the Darwinian revolution and the idea that most young rely on their adults to navigate their world. New perspectives of maturation tend to display adolescents as competent and capable of persevering through life's uncertainties and trials. There seems to be a confidence in these young people, whether there's a basis for it or not, it exists. Perceptions can be misled, and they often are, and in this case, I suspect that we have overestimated our youth's ability to comprehend adult problems. So perceptions of maturation are changing, but why might that be? My argument is that both easy access media and general industrial capitalist values bleed into child rearing and subsequent child development, and as a result create this phenomenon of accelerated maturity. So accessibility. Today's youth have absolutely no trouble getting access to adult content according to some of these statistics. 3/4 of all households in the United States have 3 or more televisions, or often one per person. In the past, televisions were typically reserved for the family living spaces, and TV viewing was more of a communal thing, but now it seems to infiltrate the bedrooms, including the bedrooms of young teens. According to Jackson in 2013, roughly 2/3 of 11 to 14-year-old children have television in their bedrooms, so around middle school age. I'm sure that some of you probably even had one for as long as you can remember. Even throughout high school, I was not allowed to have a TV in my bedroom, but I knew of family members significantly younger than me who did, and it seems to be increasingly more common. It can actually be kind of scary how early screens can be introduced to children. One study in 2003 by Rideout, Vandewater, and Wortella stated that just over a quarter of children less than 2 years of age also had television in their rooms. Now, beyond television, smartphones are another source of watching films and TV shows, and Commence in 2019 claimed that just over half of preteens owned personal smartphones before age 11, which is elementary and middle school age. And that statistic jumps up 31% as those preteens grow just a few years older. Given that there's such a selection of technological sources in our children's daily lives, it is really no surprise that they are viewing much more adult content as the years go on, and that exposure would likely be much more limited if it weren't for this plague of easy access media. Parents, monitoring what children are exposed to can be hard, especially with modern family dynamics typically demanding both parents to work in order to earn a livable income, and subsequently they become somewhat less involved in their children's lives. So just as our children are needing more monitoring, parents are becoming less able to provide it. That, in conjunction with more media, which leads to more opportunities for adult content exposure, all leads to the same thing, overall less oversight. Those who have televisions in their bedrooms have practically no oversight at all, especially at night, which is where we tend to see some of the more provocative and graphic adult content. Those who have cell phones and have no restrictions on usage time also run the same risks. Now, goals of monitoring are less to do with completely shielding and more to do with adults helping to introduce adult concepts to children appropriately and on their own terms. Shielding or sheltering children is not a realistic goal, as Elkind points out, because even if children have media restrictions at home, they are likely still going to come across inappropriate adult content elsewhere. So moving on from accessibility, what are the pressures from industrialization and capitalism on our youth to experience accelerated maturity? Well, Kasser and Lin in 2016 states that it is simply in the nature of capitalism to promote growth, competition, and other self-absorbent type values. In America and economies similar to America, these values bleed into much of our daily lives, and the introduction of technology seems to have only progressed this notion of doing things better and quicker, of which has bled into, as well, child development. As a society that tends to emphasize mastery values, as Schwartz's 1999 theory of cultural values suggests, values of being productive and successful tend to supersede other values, including nurturing, which could explain the existing push towards accelerated maturity. And what is capitalism without consumerism? Child marketing has been steadily increasing, especially considering all of these easy access platforms that companies can utilize to sell their products to children. In the 1970s, there was actually quite an uproar regarding the use of such persuasive tactics on this impressionable age group, but it was legally overturned, and to this day, the United States has very minimal regulations on how companies advertise to children, at least comparative to other democratic nations. Drawing on points I made earlier regarding capitalistic values of growth, companies have also been mining this market of accelerated development in children through various educational programs, devices, and related material. Elkine actually discusses Baby Plus, which is a device that pregnant women wear during pregnancy that sends rhythms to enhance a child's sequential learning in utero. Now, there's no consensus on whether or not Baby Plus or actually a lot of developmental material actually works, but that's not the point. The point is that companies want children to become consumers quicker, hence the influx of child marketing, and companies also capitalize off of American values of success by promoting material that aims to enhance development, both of which contribute to this phenomenon of accelerated maturity. Now that we have discussed some of the most prominent reasons behind accelerated maturity, let's discuss some of the consequences that can result from it. To understand how adult content has consequences on young adults, we need to briefly discuss why content matters. The content in films and TV shows teenagers watch are important because, for today's youth, media is an incredibly important socialization medium where learning of culturally accepted behaviors, values, beliefs, and other norms is taking place. This means that a substantial portion of what young people are learning about the world around them is through media. Much of that learning stems from observation of others. Most of us are very familiar with Bandera's infamous Bobo doll experiment, where exposure to aggression was directly related to aggressive tendencies. This theory of social learning raises some concerns to young people's bombardment with violence in film and in television. The same can be discussed with exposure to alcohol consumption and drug usage. Casual viewing can actually convince adolescents to engage in these activities, especially if there's some kind of positive association with it. Say a scene in a film depicts the cool kid in school casually smoking throughout the movie. According to Austin in 1995, if there are reward cues associated with something like smoking, it is more likely to encourage viewers to smoke. Although in today's time, smoking cigarettes is generally unfavorable, the same concept could be applied to vaping, experimenting with other drugs, consuming alcohol, and engaging in other risky adult behaviors. One of the reasons why scholars care so much about the content in these films and television programs is because there are real-life consequences from indulging in these counterfeit realities. In reference to violence, there's a lot of focus on how viewing aggression influences our behaviors when we leave the screen. According to Agarwal and Donna Sakharin in 2012, viewing violence can lead to overall desensitization, learning of aggressive tendencies, and risk-taking. Trice and Greer also note these things, as well as the increased chance of a person experiencing empathy reduction and violent media bringing out aggressive characteristics in people who have predispositions for violence. The American Psychological Association has acknowledged quite a bit of research on media aggression. It's been a popular topic for a while. A longitudinal study starting in the 1980s actually shows that there is a connection between watching violence and experiencing subsequent aggression, and that those who watch more of it are more likely to engage in, be arrested for, and prosecuted for criminal behavior as an adult. In adolescence, we've hit puberty, we're starting to feel romantic towards others, and overall there's a slight sexual desire there. It's normal, but the media plays a huge role in today's teens' experiences and education with sex. For most people in their adolescent years, sex is a foreign concept. We often have those awkward first encounters and progressively take steps further with our partners as we steadily get older. However, considering the hypersexualized nature of much film and TV content that adolescents are viewing, much of that unknown aspect is erased, and teenagers may feel more prepared to engage in sex than they actually are. During this developmental time period, teenage cognitive skills are still underdeveloped, and they are not psychologically prepared to thoroughly analyze their decisions regarding sex and the possible consequences of it. Most of the depictions of sex in media tend to be displayed positively, with less focus on the very real risks to sex, such as STDs and teen pregnancy. This means that the primary sources that young adults are getting their sex education are not actually educating them on sex as much as they are advertising it, which primarily is because sex sells, and as Elkind points out, it's almost guaranteed to attract younger viewers. I like this quote here at the bottom from Elkind's book because I think it sums up this entire argument. Sexual expression is important, but age matters. And there are risks with heavily promoting sexual expression for an age group that are not cognitively conscious of the complexities of sex. David Elkind also brings up a phenomenal concept called pseudo-sophistication, meaning that those who are exposed to adult content early on seem to know about violence, sex, crime, and otherwise adult themes, but they do not understand them. They can't understand the complexities of these topics, the very serious consequences, and how what they see on screen differs from reality. This, in combination with social learning theory, implies that children and adolescents are becoming familiar with adult concepts and are prone to mimic these behaviors without really understanding them. So how can we be better? How can we become more patient with development? We need to consciously work against some of the success-hungry and competitive values that dominate our ways of living. Children being bombarded with adult concepts and being pressured to mature quicker is not healthy and can actually be detrimental given that hurried maturity skips over or doesn't acknowledge important milestones. So as some of you are raising children, or as some of you might in the future, keep in mind that your child will be fine. They will be smart, they will learn about some of these more serious topics when the moment is right, and that by prolonging their development, you are actually helping it. So as I'm nearing the end of my presentation, here are the things that I really want you to take away from this. Today's children are being confronted with adult content like never before, and it's reasonable to assume it's only going to increase as technology invades more and more of our daily lives. Media is all around us. It's in our bedrooms, our living rooms, cell phones and laptops, and it's simply hard to escape. It's hard to even describe the influence that media has on our young people, so the content that they are viewing is crucially important. There are possible risks of viewing adult content too early. Sexual content, graphic violent content, alcohol and drug use, all of these adult concepts are too complex for teenagers to adequately assess before engaging in them. They are lacking both the appropriate cognitive development as well as the experience to be able to do so. Industrial values bleed into child rearing and child development, spurring this drive for children to mature faster, to consume quicker, and lose their innocence much sooner than they probably should. We need to actively work against much of the demands that are being placed on children, and by being patient with them as they develop their personhood, we see much healthier, stress-free development. The next few slides are my references. Feel free to pause on them and check those out if you would like. Thank you for your time and attention.